Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Balqis and I am from Group 2. On behalf of my group, I will be the first one to be presenting our slides about rationalism. Now, what is rationalism? According to Blanchard, rationalism is a Western philosophy that regards reason as the chief source and test of knowledge. So whatever comes up in a human's mind, that is the byproduct of their own thinking and deduction. The founder of rationalism is a man named René Descartes. He was a French philosopher, a mathematician, and a scientist. He was mostly known for discovering algebraic equations in the 17th century. Later on, he came up with the concept of rationalism and it became popular near the 18th century. Reines debated that the source of knowledge is from one's own thinking and not from any other external factors like social influence, family background, or experience. The three major concepts that one should know when discussing about rationalism is that first, knowledge comes from logical judgment and reasoning, meaning in order to come to a conclusion, one must rely on their mind instead of external factors. Secondly, the ability to make judgment and reasoning is actually natural. In other words, thinking is part of human nature. Thirdly, the concepts of or ideas that constitute human abilities to think about a particular subject are innate. Therefore, knowledge is innate. Next, the era of rationalism happened during the Enlightenment period, or people call it the Age of Reason. During this period, numerous people preferred scientific, political, and philosophical discourse over religious teachings. However, the concept of rationalism was not very famous in the 17th century because many people preferred empiricism, in which the basis of the philosophy believed in experience over innate abilities. Even though rationalism did not dominate the Enlightenment period, it did provide a critical foundation for the debates that arose throughout the 18th century. Now that is all from me. I will pass the presentation over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Alissya, for a very great explanation of the introduction of rationalism. Now let's move on to the characteristic of rationalism. As you guys know, rationalism is the belief that human beings or people can arrive at truth by using a reason rather than by relying on the authority of the past, on religion, or on non-rational mental processes like intuition. The other characteristic is God created the universe but does not interfere with it working. For example, God is compared to a clockmaker. He created the perfect mechanism of this universe, then left his creation to run on its own, just like a clockwork. Next is rationalists focus more on human perfection. They believe that man is inherently good and each man has the potential to perfect himself through rationality, kindness toward his fellow man, and diligence. And now let's look more to principle of their belief. Rationalism emphasizes a priori knowledge. What mean by priori knowledge is independent from experience. Examples include mathematics, tautologies, and deduction from pure reason. A posteriori knowledge is that which depends on empirical evidence. Examples include most fields of science and aspects of personal knowledge. Next is rationalists most often postulate an active mind that acts upon incoming sensory information. And rationalists emphasize deductive argument, using a logic to demonstrate that premises of an argument provide definite grounds for the conclusion, which is the Aristotle basic assumption. And now, let's move to the another presenter.
Thank you, Sister Sasha. Next, we will move on to the next slide, which is the impact of rationalism to people. Rationalism is often adopted by the Western educated Muslim, which was popular in 19th century. One of the famous Western educated Muslim was Said Amir Ali, where he made nationalism as the principle of his life. He was exposed to the Western education as he furthered his study to England. He attempted to modernize the thinking of Muslims in India because during that time, the fatalism thinking or believing in destiny was famous among the Muslims. He then published a few books where he discussed about rationalism to criticize about the irrational thinking by the Muslims. One of his book is The Spirit of Islam. Through his writing, he tried to prove that Islam is rational, where he mentioned that the Prophet bring the rational characteristic. After the coming of Prophet ﷺ, the Quran was revealed gradually along with Sunnah, which later on become the guidance of the Muslims. These sources encourage rational thinking by providing the highest value of knowledge. These two sources later on change the way the life of Arab, then followed by the rest of the world.
Thank you, Sister Afifah, for your amazing explanation. Moving on to the strength of rationalism. First and foremost, rationalism are universal and eternal. It is assumed that if one person can think, then can everyone else. And René Descartes once said about wax, we may see, smell, feel wax in its solid form and call it a wax. If we then light the wax, it becomes a different form, but with different physical features, yet we still call it a wax. Why? Because it's universal, it's logic, it's rational. From the Islamic worldview, one of our popular scholars, which is Avicenna, said that the source of human knowledge is emanation from an active intellect, through which the form of things come from God to man. The human body and senses are merely tools for preparing the human intellect to accept this manifestation. Moving on to the second strength of rationalism, which mentioned once by Sister Shasha, which is a priori. We can understand something by logic without having first to encounter it. Rationalism applies primarily to logic and mathematics, meaning there is a calculated and reasoned approach to conclusion or the truth. In Islamic worldview, Avicenna categorized this kind of knowledge as knowledge of intuition. People may have different level of intuition. Some may be able to reach a level which they do not need to connect with an active intellect to acquire knowledge, as though they already knew everything themselves intuitively, and some others might not. Last but not least, the strength of rationalism is epistemology. What is epistemology? Epistemology is the philosophical study of nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. Rationalism, therefore, applies well to fields of knowledge that have no basis in evidence, such as mathematics. For instance, mathematics acquire its practitioner to consider figures such as perfect circles, which are never been observed in reality. All the major Muslim philosophers, beginning with Al-Hindi, wrote a treatise on the nature and function of theoretical intellect, which may be referred to as the house of knowledge. Moving on to the shortcoming of rationalism.
Thank you, Arisya, for your informative explanation. So now, moving on to the next part, which is the opposite one, the shortcomings of rationalism. First and foremost, the weakness of this ideology is causing men to doubt revelation and miracles. It can be seen obviously if this ideology is used extremely, it can threaten human faith. This is because revelation and miracles are quite difficult to understand and accept by the common sense of men. As we already know, human intellect is very limited. With that, for men to think of revelation and miracles logically is kinda impossible. Thus, as Muslims, we are necessarily to accept revelation and definitely apply it in our daily life, including in the current education system. Next, the second point for the negative side of rationalism is inclined to knowledge of relativism. In this context, relativism refers to the doctrine that knowledge, truth, and morality exist in relation to culture, society, or historical context, and are not absolute. This means that these rationalists don't believe in science. For instance, atheists only can be convinced by visible things based on logic of their intellect. Because of that, they don't believe in the existence of Allah, the revelation, and also an eternal world after the day of judgment. Whereas all of these are the pillars of faith that must be believed according to the teaching of Islam.
Consequently, this group will be more concerned with the subjects than the objects, so that they allow whatever comes out of their minds without observing rational objects sensitively. Last but not least, the application of this ideology can result in moral and spiritual perspectives considered less relevant anymore. Behind the rapid development achieved, these aspects should be emphasized to avoid the distortion of today's Muslim thinking. Due to this rational thinking, Islam exists as a theme of thought highlighted by the modern perspective of their creation without referring to recognized religious scholars. In addition to the occurrence of socio-cultural complications among youngsters, such as losing customs and glorifying a lifestyle based on hedonism and desires, indirectly, this can cause Islamic identity to deteriorate and the adherence to the Quran and the true teachings of Islam became weak, as well as they only follow the logic of reason invented by Westerners. That's all from me. Thank you.
With the presented slides before, we concluded in one big mind map for rationalism, for its concept, characteristics, principles, impact, strengths, and shortcoming. So for the concept, we know that rationalism is a knowledge come from logical judgment and the ability to make judgment, and human abilities to think about a particular subject are innate. For the characteristics, first, people arrive at truth by using reason. Second, God created the universe but does not interfere with its working. Third, focus is placed upon human perfection. Moving on to the principle, rationalism emphasizes a priori knowledge, often postulate an active mind, and emphasize deductive arguments. What is the impact of rationalism? Syed Amir Ali trying to change Muslim in India by writing books to prove that Islam is rational, and one of his books is The Spirit of Islam. Moving on to the strength. There are three strengths of rationalism. The first one is universal and eternal, second one a priori, and the last one is epistemology. For the shortcoming, rationalism may cause men to doubt revelation and miracles, incline to knowledge of relativism, and irrelevant of moral and spiritual perspective.
Hi, Assalamualaikum everyone.
Hi.
Hai, Waalaikumsalam.
Salam.
Guys, have you wondered why 1 plus 1 is equals to 2?
Because it's logical and rational.
Rational? What's that?
So basically, rational is based on accordance with reason or logic.
How about rationalism?
As we know, the morpheme ism brings meaning as a practice or a system. So, rationalism is a practice or belief that regards reason as the chief source and the test of knowledge. Rationalism normally is being applied in mathematics since it is the paradigm of knowledge.
True, rationalism often applied in mathematics. Apart from that, rationalism is also associated with the belief in existence of God.
I think the word rationalism or being rational now can be applied in any context, and it doesn't have to be about the exclusive of God or maths. It can simply be about logic. Let's say you get into an argument with your friend because they hurt your feelings multiple times, right? When you confront them, oftentimes you get carried away with your emotions. You start crying, you start pulling their hair, or you start yelling, throwing things, but you're not solving the problem because those are not irrational acts. In order to sort out the problem, you have to provide evidence. So you have to tell your friend specifically what they did that hurt you. Maybe it could be their tones that was offensive or their words that were hurtful. So I think the key to rationalism is that you have to stay logical as possible so that you can understand each other better.
Brilliant point, Alissya. In my opinion, realistic human, whether we accept or not, our life is always being managed and governed by logic and reason, which are inbuilt in each and every human as an independent thinking entity. Either consciously or unconsciously, every individual employs logic and reason when faced with harsh realities in life.
Shasha, after what both Arisha and Alissya discussed, what do you think about characteristic of rationalism?
From my point of view, rationalists think that all human beings are equal and always strive to be perfect. And they think humans have control over their own life, and they believe that God is indeed powerful, but they do not believe that He is all powerful. And rationalists think that they can improve themselves and the world around them. They focus more on the present as opposed to hereafter. And rationalists always deal with issue of truth and believe that because they need a reason rather than by relying on the past or on religious faith.
I agree with you. Rationalists always deal with the issues of truth because for them everything must have reasons as evidence, so it becomes logical. They refuse to believe something if they are unable to find the reasons behind it, especially it's related to supernatural events. However, human intellect is naturally made for finding the truth. Slowly, they started to realize that it indeed exists. Yet, their ignorance makes them choose to not believe the truth.
Wow, that was a brilliant discussion, everyone. Nisa, can you sum it up for us?
Sure, Alissya. Okay, to sum up this discussion, definitely, Islam and rationality shouldn't be separated according to the Islamic worldview. Instead, these two aspects need to merge and depend on each other. In addition, it is certainly not wrong to think rationally in Islam. And even Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala has commanded mankind to acquire knowledge in abundance regardless of religion or science. Therefore, in facing the challenges of today's increasingly sophisticated world, Muslims must be valiant and determined to compete with the adherents of other religions in order to prove that Islam is not a backward religion, so that every Muslim must strive further improve their quality of life by mastering the heritage of sciences that was once dominated by Islamic scholars such as Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Sina, and Al-Farabi. That's all from me. Thank you guys for investing time together. See you then, and Assalamualaikum. Bye.
Waalaikumsalam. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
What is rationalism? Rationalism is a philosophical doctrine that holds the view that knowledge is derived from reason rather than experience. Hence, for the rationalists, reason is the ultimate source of knowledge and the test of its validity. Rationalism is characterized by three major theses, namely, first, knowledge is derived from intuition, or rational insight, and deductive reasoning, rather than from sense perception. Second, the ideas or concepts that constitute the mind's ability to think are innate, and therefore, knowledge of a particular thing is innate. Now, what these 3 points suggest for the rationalists is that reality has an intrinsically logical structure, which contains certain truths that can be accessed by the mind. For this reason, the rationalists believe that truths exist and that the intellect can grasp them directly. And for the rationalists, these truths are fundamental so that denying them would cause us to fall into contradiction. In other words, these truths are self-evidently true and that their negation is self-evidently false. Consider, for example, this proposition. All triangles have 3 angles. Logically speaking, this proposition is absolutely true because as long as an object is a triangle, it must have 3 angles. Also, for the rationalists, the knowledge of this proposition is not derived from experience, but from reason. For sure, we need not resort to experience in order to say that indeed all triangles have 3 angles. Through thinking alone, that is, through the use of reason, we can arrive at the knowledge that all triangles have 3 angles.